You think being yourself is strength. That's why you're weak, visible, and already catalogued by everyone who will eventually destroy you. Machiavelli knew. The legible man is the conquered man. You've been lied to about power. The architects of that lie told you that strength comes from knowing yourself, expressing yourself, staying true to yourself. They sold you authenticity as armor when it's actually a target painted on your back. Machiavelli understood what modern self-help gurus deliberately conceal. Legibility is death. The moment another person can accurately predict your values, your reactions, your boundaries, your loyalties, they own you. Not metaphorically, mathematically. They possess a complete tactical map of your psychology. In possession of that map means they control every negotiation, every conflict, every interaction before it begins. Consider the practical mechanics. When you proudly declare your principles, honesty, loyalty, fairness, whatever moral framework you've adopted, you've just handed every adversary an instruction manual for your manipulation. They know exactly which levers produce which responses. Threaten your sense of fairness, and you'll compromise on strategy to maintain it. Appeal to your loyalty, and you'll tolerate exploitation to prove it. Challenge your honesty, and you'll reveal information to defend it. This is why Machiavelli's work remains banned from polite discourse 5 centuries later, not because it's evil. Power dynamics don't operate on moral axes, but because it names the game that society requires you not to see. Every institution you've been conditioned to respect, education, media, corporate culture, even therapeutic frameworks, shares a unified interest in producing legible, predictable citizens. Authentic people are manageable people. The man who proudly announces, "I always tell the truth," has eliminated deception from his strategic arsenal. The man who declares, "I never betray my friends," has created hostages his enemies can target. The man who broadcasts his political beliefs, his moral boundaries, his emotional triggers has built a comprehensive database of his own vulnerabilities and made it publicly searchable. Meanwhile, observe who actually accumulates power. Not the authentic, not the consistent. Study the individuals who move through institutions collecting leverage while leaving no psychological fingerprint. The executive who agrees with everyone and commits to nothing. The politician whose positions shift perfectly with changing conditions. The strategist who maintains warm relationships with incompatible factions. They're not empty, they're formless. And formlessness is the supreme evolutionary adaptation in human power dynamics. Machiavelli identified the fundamental error that destroys most men seeking power. They choose a single archetype and mistake limitation for identity. They become the lion, all force, all visibility, or the fox, all cunning, all subterfuge. Both paths lead to defeat. The lion operates through direct domination. He announces his presence, displays his strength, enforces compliance through visible threat. But the lion suffers from a fatal mathematical problem. Force is catalogable. Every display of strength teaches observers your capabilities, your limits, your patterns. And predictability means your enemies aren't afraid. They're calculating. They're identifying your range, your triggers, your recovery time. They're building the trap while you're enjoying the fear you produce. The fox operates through manipulation and cunning. He maneuvers and deceives, outthinks. But the fox suffers his own fatal flaw. Cunning without enforcement capacity is theater. When your deception is discovered, and all deception eventually faces this risk, you have no secondary defense. The clever manipulator who cannot deploy force when exposed becomes the example other manipulators use to demonstrate what happens to the powerless who attempt cunning. Machiavelli's insight cuts through both failures. The prince must be both, not alternating between them, but embodying the unified capacity for violence and deception simultaneously. This isn't philosophical. It's a structural requirement of power acquisition. Force without deception creates legible patterns that enemies root around. You become the predictable aggressor, and intelligent opponents simply avoid direct confrontation. Conversely, deception without force creates exposure points that collapse under pressure. When your manipulation is discovered, if you cannot pivot immediately to overwhelming force, you're simply a liar facing consequences. Consider Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli's model prince. When dealing with the Orsini conspirators, Borgia didn't simply kill them, that's lion thinking. And he didn't simply outwit them, that's fox thinking. He invited them to a reconciliation banquet, embraced them as friends, shared wine and laughter, spent hours rebuilding trust through apparent vulnerability. Then, at the moment of maximum psychological disarmament, he had them strangled. The fox disarmed them. The lion executed them. Neither archetype alone achieves the objective. This is what authentic men cannot comprehend. The unified capacity for warmth and violence, agreement and betrayal, cooperation and elimination. They view this duality as hypocrisy because they're trapped in the illusion that consistency equals integrity. The man who masters both natures becomes mathematically impossible to categorize. Is he a friend or an enemy, ally or threat? The question itself is wrong. He is whatever the strategic moment requires. Machiavelli's reconnaissance across Italian city-states revealed a pattern. Certain psychological profiles fail with statistical regularity, not because they're morally deficient, but because they're strategically legible. The ideologue is the man imprisoned by his own beliefs. He's constructed a comprehensive worldview and mistakes its completeness for strength. Here's the mechanism. The ideologue cannot deviate from his stated principles without experiencing cognitive dissonance that feels like identity dissolution. This means any adversary who understands his ideology can engineer situations where his principles become traps. Tell the free market ideologue that regulation is tyranny, then watch him defend corporate monopolies that destroy him. The ideologue will literally argue himself into defeat rather than abandon the belief system he's mistaken for himself. Machiavelli observed this in Savonarola, the Dominican friar who temporarily seized Florence through ideological purity. Savonarola couldn't adapt when political conditions shifted because adaptation would mean philosophical compromise. So he chose consistency over survival. They burned him in the Piazza della Signoria. His principles didn't protect him. They identified the exact location to apply flame. The loyalist is the man who weaponizes his own relationships against himself. He's proud of his loyalty. To friends, family, organizations. What he doesn't recognize, every loyalty is a hostage his enemies can take. The loyalist has publicly declared which entities he will sacrifice himself to protect. Adversaries don't need to threaten him directly. They threaten what he's loyal to, then watch him destroy himself in its defense. The loyalist thinks he's demonstrating strength through sacrifice. He's actually performing predictable resource transfer to anyone who identifies his loyalty targets. The authentic man is perhaps the most thoroughly conquered because he's celebrated by the very culture that exploits him. He's been told that knowing himself is wisdom, that expressing himself is courage. He's constructed a coherent identity and maintains it consistently across contexts. This psychological consistency is a comprehensive tactical vulnerability. Every interaction yields reconnaissance data. His reactions are predictable, his boundaries are mappable, his triggers are testable. Watch what happens when the authentic man encounters strategic deception. Someone mirrors his values, shares his interests, validates his identity, and he bonds immediately. He's been trained to recognize authenticity in others, to trust people who seem real. So when someone performs authenticity strategically, the authentic man cannot distinguish the performance from reality. He trusts the mirror. The mirror accumulates leverage. The mirror eventually cashes out. Here's what unites all three archetypes. They mistake psychological rigidity for strength. The ideologue's fixed beliefs, the loyalist's permanent bonds, the authentic man's stable identity, all three have chosen consistency in an environment where adaptability is the only sustainable advantage. And in Machiavelli's framework, the frozen are already dead. Machiavelli didn't theorize from a library. He observed power in real time. His primary case study was Cesare Borgia, not because Borgia was moral, but because Borgia understood the mathematics of unpredictability better than any contemporary prince. Cesare Borgia inherited nothing, yet within 5 years he carved a personal state from the Romagna region through a mechanism most observers couldn't identify. He remained psychologically unreadable while his enemies remained transparent. When Borgia entered Romagna, the region was controlled by petty tyrants, the Orsini, the Vitelli, the Baglioni families. These men operated through traditional power, visible force, predictable alliances, consistent brutality. Borgia studied their patterns while revealing nothing of his own decision-making architecture. Then he deployed strategic formlessness. He allied with the Orsini while simultaneously negotiating with their enemies. He appeared weak when strong, strong when weak. His enemies couldn't determine if he was friend or threat, cunning or foolish. This uncertainty paralyzed their decision-making while Borgia operated with complete clarity. The Sinigaglia trap demonstrates the principle perfectly. The Orsini conspirators had rebelled against Borgia, then sued for peace. A predictable prince would have either rejected reconciliation or accepted it cautiously. Borgia did neither. He enthusiastically embraced reconciliation, showering the conspirators with honors, sharing military intelligence, coordinating strategy as if the rebellion had never occurred. His warmth was so convincing that the conspirators brought minimal security to their reconciliation meeting. Borgia strangled them all in a single night. The lesson isn't the violence. Violence is common. The lesson is the psychological preparation. Borgia understood that execution is easy once you've disarmed your enemy's threat assessment capacity. The Orsini couldn't simultaneously believe Borgia was forgiving enough to reconcile and ruthless enough to massacre. Their mental models couldn't hold both possibilities. Contrast this with Borgia's ultimate failure. When Pope Alexander VI died, Borgia fell critically ill simultaneously. Despite being bedridden, Borgia had enough influence to block enemies from the papacy, but he made a single fatal error. He became predictable. Borgia supported Giuliano della Rovere based on previous patterns. Della Rovere had been Alexander VI's enemy, which meant, in traditional alliance logic, he should favor Cesare Borgia against their shared enemies. Julius II, understanding this exact assumption, encouraged it. He made promises. He demonstrated warmth. He mirrored Borgia's expectations perfectly. Then, the moment Julius secured the papacy, he systematically dismantled everything Borgia had built. Borgia had assumed Julius would behave consistently with his previous patterns. That assumption, that one moment of believing in psychological continuity, destroyed him. This pattern repeats across power structures with mathematical regularity. The CEO who successfully navigates 20 years of hostile negotiations finally trusts a friendly acquirer based on cultural alignment, and discovers post-merger that the friendliness was theater. The politician who successfully deploys calculated positions across an entire career finally takes a principled stand. And opposition research turns that authentic moment into the weapon that ends their career. History's lesson is not ambiguous. Psychological consistency, even for a moment, creates the aperture through which defeat enters. Understanding formlessness theoretically means nothing if you cannot execute it practically. The process begins with recognition of a brutal fact. You do not have a true self worth protecting. What you call your authentic identity is actually a composite of social conditioning and reactive trauma responses you made unconsciously as a child, and then calcified into personality. Adaptive mirroring is the foundational practice. When you enter any environment, your first objective is not to be liked or respected. Your first objective is to become contextually invisible while remaining observationally acute. Identify the dominant values in the room, then reflect them back with approximately 80% intensity. At this threshold, you register as one of us without triggering deeper investigation. While mirroring, you're harvesting reconnaissance. Who defers to whom, what topics create tension, what language patterns indicate coalition membership. You're building a tactical map of power distribution, and because you've made yourself contextually invisible through mirroring, no one's building a similar map of you. Strategic agreement is the next evolution. Most people treat agreement and disagreement as authentic expressions of their actual positions. This is tactically insane. Agreement and disagreement are tools for managing information flow, nothing more. When someone expresses a position you privately oppose, strategic agreement maintains relationship access, encourages them to reveal more information, and prevents them from categorizing you as opposition. Practical application. Your colleague advocates for a strategy you recognize as flawed. The authentic response is to argue. The strategic response is to agree enthusiastically, ask clarifying questions that make them commit more deeply, and ensure your agreement is documented. When the strategy fails, you have relationship capital with the colleague and documented evidence you weren't the architect. Controlled revelation separates strategic formlessness from mere opacity. Total inscrutability creates suspicion. The solution isn't transparency. It's engineering your vulnerability displays as carefully as you engineer your strength displays. Identify low-value truths about yourself, preferences, stories, minor struggles that create the appearance of authenticity without revealing decision-making architecture. Share these selectively in contexts where vulnerability is socially rewarded. The recipient experiences the dopamine hit of connecting with you, catalogs you as authentic and trustworthy, and stops investigating deeper. Positional fluidity completes the framework. The authentic man develops positions, then defends them consistently because he's confused positions with identity. The formless man holds positions the way a poker player holds cards. They're useful for the current hand, then discarded when the hand ends. This requires psychological rewiring. You must train yourself to experience no cognitive dissonance when you advocate passionately for position A on Monday and position B on Wednesday. Practice arguing the opposite of what you believe. Do this until you can feel the psychological resistance dissolve. This engineering process produces a specific result. You become a mirror that shows people what they expect to see while remaining entirely opaque to analysis. You're warm with those who value warmth, calculating with those who value strategy, idealistic with idealists, cynical with cynics. People will call this fake. Let them. While they're performing authenticity and broadcasting their complete psychological profiles, you're accumulating comprehensive intelligence on them while remaining strategically invisible. What comes next requires you to confront the psychological operation that's been running on you since childhood. You've been trained to believe you have a core self that must be discovered, expressed, and protected. This belief is the control mechanism. Every institution you've encountered shares a unified incentive, producing legible, predictable individuals whose behavior can be forecasted and managed. Every time you make a statement of identity, I'm someone who values honesty, I'm loyal to my friends, you've created a constraint on your future behavior. Not a constraint imposed by others, but a constraint you'll enforce on yourself through the psychological discomfort of inconsistency. This self-imposed constraint is precisely what makes you controllable. Here's the dissolution protocol. Your current identity is not you. It's a configuration you're running that's been optimized for other people's objectives. The values you protect, the consistency you maintain, these weren't chosen through sovereign analysis. They were installed through social conditioning that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. The sovereign individual recognizes, if this identity was constructed, it can be deconstructed. If these values were installed, they can be uninstalled. Nothing about your current psychological architecture is permanent or worth defending simply because it currently exists. Practical execution requires systematic dismantling. Belief dissolution. Examine every principle you've claimed as your own. Ask, does maintaining this belief serve my strategic interests or constrain my operational flexibility? If it constrains you more than it serves you, it's not a principle, it's a liability. Loyalty audit. Map every relationship you've categorized as loyalty-based. Ask, is this loyalty reciprocal, strategic, or merely habitual? If someone betrayed you tomorrow, would they suffer consequences proportional to the access you've granted them? If not, you're not in a loyalty relationship. You're in an asymmetric vulnerability position. Consistency. Elimination. Identify every domain where you've prided yourself on consistency. Recognize that this consistency is reconnaissance data. Begin deliberately introducing inconsistency. Take opposing positions in different contexts. Vary your patterns. Make yourself unstudyable. What remains after this dissolution? Not emptiness. Pure strategic potential. You become a configuration that can reconfigure instantly based on environmental demands. You're no longer constrained by who you were yesterday or what values you've publicly claimed. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that the prince must be a great pretender and dissembler. Not that the prince should lie, but that the prince should have no fixed nature to be truthful about. The conquered man builds an identity, then defends it. The sovereign man recognizes that identity itself is the vulnerability, dismantles it systematically, and operates from formless adaptability. You've reached the terminal decision point. The choice is not between good and evil. The choice is between legibility and sovereignty, between remaining a predictable asset in other people's strategies or becoming an unreadable force pursuing your own. Understand what you're accepting if you choose legibility, a life of systematic exploitation dressed up as authenticity. You'll continue broadcasting your values, maintaining your consistency, and everyone with basic pattern recognition will continue using that data against you. You'll tell yourself you're maintaining integrity. You're actually maintaining exploitability. Now consider the alternative, strategic formlessness executed as operational protocol. Routine elimination. You've been commuting the same route, eating at the same places, maintaining the same schedule. Each repetition is a data point. Introduce randomness. Vary your patterns. Predictability is a mathematical vulnerability that competent adversaries will eventually exploit. Belief. Opacity. You've been sharing your political views, your philosophical frameworks in conversations on social media. You thought you were engaging in discourse. You were actually distributing targeting information. When asked your position on contested topics, become a mirror. Reflect the question back. Explore multiple perspectives without revealing which one you've adopted. Relationship fluidity. You've categorized people as friends, enemies, allies, and treated these categories as stable. Relationships are temporary alliances based on current interest alignment. Nothing more. Maintain warm relationships with everyone while granting deep access to no one. Emotional inscrutability. You've been expressing authentic emotions. Anger when provoked, joy when pleased. Every emotional display is information about your internal state, and information about your internal state is leverage. Train yourself to experience emotions privately while displaying them strategically. This operational framework produces a specific result: you become mathematically impossible to model. Your adversaries cannot build predictive algorithms about your behavior because there are no stable patterns to extrapolate from. Here's what you're trading: the comfort of authenticity for the power of adaptability. The satisfaction of being known for the advantage of being unreadable. Most people cannot execute this trade. They'll absorb this framework intellectually, feel momentarily empowered, then return to their authentic selves within days because the psychological discomfort of formlessness exceeds their tolerance. This is fine. The power landscape requires a massive base of predictable, exploitable individuals for the formless minority to operate within. So here's the final sorting. Are you capable of operating without a fixed identity, or do you require the psychological comfort of knowing who you are? One path leads to sovereignty. The other leads to continued exploitation. If you choose sovereignty, understand that execution is permanent. The moment you revert to legible patterns, you've telegraphed that formlessness was performance, and informed adversaries will exploit that revelation ruthlessly. The protocol is simple. Eliminate every predictable element in your psychological architecture. Remove consistent beliefs. Dissolve stable loyalties. Erase routine patterns. Dismantle authentic emotional expression. What remains is pure adaptive capacity, the ability to become whatever the strategic moment requires. Machiavelli's final lesson. Power doesn't go to the good or the evil, it goes to the unreadable. The prince who can be accurately modeled will be systematically defeated by the prince who remains strategically opaque. You've been given the framework, you understand the mechanism, you've seen the historical proof. Now comes the only question that matters. Will you execute, or will you remain a predictable asset in someone else's strategy? Choose legibility, and you're choosing continued exploitation dressed up as authenticity. Choose formlessness, and you're choosing sovereignty at the cost of the comforting illusion that you're supposed to be someone in particular. There is no third choice. There is only execution or rationalization, power or performance, sovereignty or subjugation. Machiavelli wrote The Prince 5 centuries ago. The princes who understood it ruled. The princes who rejected it were conquered. Become unreadable or remain ruled. The selection begins now.